Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is Sean Finan. I'm the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to webinar number 41, which is going to discuss exploring the sustainable management of agricultural green waste in Ireland. So before we begin, just a very brief introduction to the Irish Bioenergy Association. For those of you who may not be aware of what we do as an organization. So we were established in 1999. We are the representative voice for the Irish bioenergy industry on the island of Ireland. And our membership is spread across the sectors of biomass, solid biomass, biogas, biomethane, biofuels, biochar, wood fuels, and energy crops. Our main objective and work is around the area of policy, of advocacy, of knowledge transfer, and we have a broad and diverse membership. Our membership includes farmers, foresters, small and medium enterprises, some technology providers, some semi-state organizations, fuel suppliers, academic bodies, and really anyone interested in the bioenergy sector. We also are involved in a number of R&D projects. Currently, we are rolling out the Small Biogas Demonstration Programme, which is a Department of Agriculture funded EIP, European Innovation Partnership project. We have an Interreg project called 3C and a follow-on project which is about to start called Cascade. And we also work to roll out the Midlands Bioenergy Development Programme, which is a Just Transition funded project covering the Midlands region. We also administer and manage the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme, which is a certification scheme for wood fuel suppliers. Further details is available on our website, www.erbia.org. We'd encourage you to look on our website for a variety of resources which are available there, including fact sheets, recording of previous webinars, and a whole host of other documents that might be of interest to you. Our ethos and objective is to work towards a sustainable energy future with bioenergy. This is number 41, webinar 41 on our series this morning. We have had a break over the summer months, and we now hope to kick off again with our series for the remainder of the year. And we hope to run fortnightly on a Wednesday from 9:30 to 10:30 with a host of different topics and speakers. We're finalizing our agenda for the next number of webinars, and we will confirm on social media and through our communications channels details of the next webinar in the coming days. If anyone online this morning is attending and would like to present at a webinar or tell us more about their product, their technology, their project, then we would be happy to hear from you to discuss what the options may be in terms of completing a webinar. As you can see, we've covered a broad range of topics so far, right across the different sectors, across the different technologies, with a mix of case studies, technical webinars, and indeed a whole host of external and internal presenters covering a wide range of topics. So all of the recordings of the webinar shown on your screen now are available via YouTube, our YouTube channel, or indeed on our website if you want to look back and look at any of the previous recordings. So this morning's webinar, as I said, is number 41 in our series. I will be your MC for this morning. Before we get into the presentation on the topic this morning, we will have a short introduction from Bernard Harris. Bernard is an agricultural inspector with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. We will then present on the sustainable management of agricultural green waste in Ireland. That will be presented partly by myself, by my colleague Noel Gavigan, who is the Technical Executive in the Irish Bioenergy Association, and Stephen McCormack, who is our Project Executive. There is an opportunity for you to pose questions to the panel or questions on any aspect of the presentation or the report through the Q&A tab, which is available at the bottom of your screen. We will also endeavour to answer as many questions as possible. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available, as I said, on our website and YouTube channel in the coming days after the webinar. So moving along, I'd like to introduce to you Bernard Harris. Bernard, if you want to turn on your camera and unmute, and you're very welcome to this morning's webinar. Maybe just from a Department of Agriculture perspective, if you want to just give a brief introduction, that would be great. Thanks very much, Bernard.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and good morning, everybody. In relation to the management of agricultural green waste, look, Sean will take us through the key dates, which includes the ending of the exemption for agricultural green waste burning from the 30th of November. From a legislative perspective, obviously the Department of Environment, Climate and Communication have overall responsibility for this area. However, DAFM do work closely with the Department of Environment in building awareness of the changes, which will guide farmers and landowners to the alternative options available when the exemption to burn agricultural green waste ends. Just to provide a little bit of background, in late 2022, ARBIA were commissioned to undertake a piece of work, and Sean will go through that in more detail, in the delivery of a feasibility study to explore sustainable management of green waste, which included the carrying out of a survey and consultation with wider stakeholders. But also a key outcome of that is to communicate to farmers, landowners, the key changes that were agreed last year. Sean and colleagues will also take us through the key changes and opportunities for alternative approaches. In addition, each farmer will receive a formal communication on this by post shortly. So that will inform more in terms of the key changes that are happening. I suppose, looking with Sean, with that, I'll pass back to you. But by way of an introduction, thank you very much for your work in this area.
That's great, and thanks very much, Bernard, for your attendance this morning and for that introduction. So you set the scene very nicely for our slides. So I'm going to reshare our screen again now and go back to the slides. Okay, so that leads us into our presentation this morning. So by way of introduction, so in 2009, farmers, and since 2009, farmers have had an exemption which allowed them to burn agricultural green waste. So agricultural green waste is defined as uncontaminated wood, trees, tree trimmings, leaves, brush, or other similar waste generated by agricultural practices. The legislative context for this exemption is set out under SI number 286/2009, and the exemption has been extended on several occasions since 2009. The burning of green waste is allowed following notification to the local authority. So a farmer has to submit a notification to the local authority confirming that burning is a last resort following application of the waste hierarchy. So the farmer has to confirm that they have considered the options of reduction, reuse, recycling, salvage, and disposal as alternatives for this green waste material in advance of the final last resort to the burning stage. So as Bernard said, in November 2022, the Irish Bioenergy Association was commissioned by the Department of Agriculture to complete a feasibility study to look at the various different sustainable management practices and alternative uses for agricultural green waste, focusing on cut green waste, covering the areas which I've outlined above, uncontaminated wood, tree trimmings, leaves, and other waste generated, green waste generated from agricultural practices. So our role as an organisation was solely in terms of developing the report and identify and examine the sustainable management practices. And then it was the role of the department, DECC and DEFM to take the findings from the report and ultimately come up with the decision which has been undertaken to have a final period of burning up to the end of November. So moving on, why is the burning of agricultural green waste ending? And the understanding of ARBIA in terms of the report and why it's ending is to improve the sustainable management of agricultural green waste, which will, in the broader context, improve air quality and human health. So it will also better utilize the material for more sustainable alternative uses, and it will enhance and promote biodiversity. So there's been some changes, I suppose, with regard to the CAP program in terms of scrub and other areas. There's also been an enhanced focus as a country on the bioeconomy and the production of sustainable materials. So all that feeds into the context for which the burning of green waste is ending. And just by way of example here, the report contains a number of case studies. And this particular case study is from an area of Germany called Baden-Baden, where they have a production or processing facility for agriculture, for green waste, and indeed a broad mix of green waste. And we can discuss that case study further in the presentation. Next slide, just about ourselves as the authors. So the RB executive staff team were the ones who compiled the report. The report is published and available on our website and on the Department of Agriculture website, and there is a link to the report later on in the slides, which we can also post in the chat later. But the team members that were involved in the development of the report were myself. My own background is I'm a chartered engineer with the Institute of Engineers, and I'm an engineer by background. My colleague Noel Gavigan comes from an agricultural science background and has been the technical executive of the Irish Bioenergy Association for a long number of years and has a broad-ranging experience in all the technical aspects. And you will hear from Noel in a short while, who will present some of the slides. Our colleague Stephen comes from a science background and has, again, a broad range of qualifications in the scientific area and also in the environmental sustainability area. And Stephen contributed significantly to the development of the report and various aspects of that. And also, at the time when the report was published back in November, and during the development of the report, Pádraig O'Higgins was a member of our team. Unfortunately, Pádraig has left RBA to take up another role in a different organisation in recent months, but Pádraig's background was in law, sustainable development, PR, and also in stakeholder engagement. So as you can see, there was a broad, diverse team working on this with a broad range of backgrounds and experience. So about the report, so it was a 2 to 3 month period to develop the report, which was very, very tight. It was a very intense piece of work. For your information, we assessed existing data around burning notifications. So there are, depending on the year, the range in the number of notifications issued to local authorities is in the range from 2,000 to 3,000. So falling some way of an average about 2,500 per year over the last number of years. A literature review was completed regarding the alternative practices. That was a big part of Stephen's work on this, and also the case studies, and Stephen will explain the case studies. And just we have an example of one of the case studies from France there, just a few photographs from that, from the Bacage system in France, so Stephen can outline that later. We did an extensive stakeholder engagement. We identified how green waste arises on farms. That was identified in consultation with stakeholders. We also did a farmer survey at the National Ploughing Championships. All the results of that are included within the report. And also there was an engagement with various different stakeholders, including all the main farm organisations, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Environment, Communications and Climate, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, Teagasc, and quite an extensive engagement with the local authorities. And I would like to acknowledge the LGMA in terms of their assistance with that, and also to all the local authorities who fed back in writing to us with their feedback in terms of the various aspects associated with this. So the sustainable alternatives and management practices were also documented, and the report recommendations and conclusions were identified, and the report was completed in November 2022. So just moving on, as Bernard had outlined, so following the completion of the report in early 2023, the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications announced that the practice of agricultural burning of agricultural green waste will end on the 30th of November. the 30th of November 2023, and to facilitate a final transition, a last short time period for burning will reopen from the 1st of September, which is this week, and close on the 30th of November. And very clearly, DECC and Minister Ryan in his communications has indicated that there will be no further exemptions to this. Just to bring everyone up to speed and make sure everyone is fully aware of the dates and the final transition period for a last burning period. And as I said, again, the report was considered by the department, and on the basis of the report, this decision was taken. Material types, I'm going to now hand over to my colleague Noel Gavigan, who will take you through the various different material types, and then Stephen will follow on from Noel, and then I will come back in at the end just to conclude. Thank you very much, and over to you, Noel.
Okay, thanks very much, Sean. So what I will do in this presentation, I'll concentrate mainly on how the material is generated. Our colleague Stephen will look at the different options you would have in dealing with it. But first of all, it's important to get a context on what's generated, how it's generated, and so to allow the second half of the conversation to make more sense. So predominantly, most of this material is coming from the management of hedgerows. So we're talking light branching material, possibly some leaf, and it depends on the rate of management of those hedgerows. But really, you're talking about that sort of material in the largest context. There is some, hedgerow maintenance really is the larger part of it. There is obviously on farms, there's always windfall. We're getting into the storm season again now, and we're getting more of a storm season in the autumn each year. So we will see some windfall material coming out. That tends to be larger material that can catch the wind. So it's a different nature of material. And what we're likely to see, and we are already seeing a lot of, is pests infected material. So ultimately, ash dieback is really starting to take a toll. You can see it in hedgerows right across the country. So over the next 5 years, we're definitely going to see a lot of material coming out of from the ash trees, which is unfortunate, very unfortunate to see. But it is going to be up to farmers to have to deal with that material. It's on farmers' land, and whether it's near a public road or whether it's in a field, it's something that farmers are going to have to unfortunately manage. And there is going to be quite a lot of that material in the next number of years. Now, it's important also to note that the exemption doesn't apply for the controlled burning of growing vegetation. So that's not something that we cover within this report. This is covered if you're interested in reading the actual legislation. It's the Wildlife Act 1976 section. In terms of the management of invasive species, so we do see that becoming an issue in many places, be it rhododendron or whatever other species there. That is also, we refer people to the National Parks and Wildlife Service for that. So really what we're talking about here is on-farm material coming from hedgerows, coming from standing trees or fallen trees. And that's where this report looks to. Now, if you go to the next page, Sean, please. Now, so in terms of the general considerations to look at how you would manage the green waste. So first of all, the best option is the way you manage it. Can you reduce the amount of waste that you're producing? It goes back to the waste hierarchy. The first thing is to try and reduce the volume of waste that you're going to produce. So question one, do you need to cut it? Is there a way you can cut it that'll mean that there's less waste generated? So Stephen will talk a bit more about it in terms of using flail cutters, and I can cover a little bit here as well. But effectively, where hedgerows are managed on a very regular basis, the material that's generated is just absorbed back into the hedgerow. It's dropped down through it by the machine. Doesn't need to be collected. There's no waste generated in that sense. And it's generally all covered in one operation. So you can maintain the hedge, not have to deal with the material afterwards. And it's usually, in most cases, it's the most preferred method of dealing with the material. So that's something we would encourage and report. Most farmers are doing that anyway. We see a lot of it is being the general practice. Now, the next thing is, if the green material is generated, okay, how can we reduce that option there? And if there is land clearance operation, that's separate, that's under DEI, that may need an environmental impact assessment, and that comes in under different thresholds. So we won't go into that too much on this. Predominantly, we're looking at general day-to-day farm management of your hedgerows, of your tree material. So the first thing is, can you reduce the volume that needs to be collected? And in general, farms are doing that already and have been doing it as a general practice in farm management and hedgerow management. So Sean, I might just on to the next page there, please. Now, the practical considerations for farms. So first of all, in dealing with this material, what volume is generated? Are we talking large volumes? Are we talking about something that can be handled quite readily, or is it something that we're looking at mountains of material which is going to require a lot of machinery work, several hours to do? So the volume is going to be very important there, and that comes back to the management set and where the material is coming from. So obviously hedgerows, your hedge cutter, your flail cutter, whatever, and often a contractor machine, and it's dealt with quite readily. If it's wind-blown material, or if it's a hedgerow that's been maintained, which we'll go into a little bit later on, that hasn't been maintained in maybe 5 or 10 years, there's going to be a different type of material coming out of that. So it will take different management in dealing with the material, and the volume and the nature of it is going to be very different. Is a contractor being used? So what equipment do they have to deal with that? Obviously a hedge cutter. Do they have a wood chipper to actually chip up material afterwards? And in particular, where you have larger material, that would be useful, or mid-sized material. And what other options are there so to use that material? So again, Stephen will go a little bit more into that focus, but can you use it somewhere else on the farm? Is there other options, or does it have any use off-site? In terms of gathering that material as well, it's very, very important that it's not contaminated. And we'll see that in particular for uses as energy. It's the general practice, seen it myself, done it myself, is where you have material cut and it's been pushed with a front end loader or a box and pushed into heaps for burning afterwards. The issue with that is you're gathering soil. Even if you don't see it, as that material has been dragged across the ground, it picks up soil contaminated, brushed onto the branches, and that is a particular issue in terms of going into a wood chipper afterwards. You will see the knives in a wood chipper blunted after 20 minutes operation if you've got soil contaminated material going in. So it's an absolute no in terms of how you would gather that material. The only way of gathering that material is it must be picked up clean off the ground. So there's forestry equipment that's dedicated for doing that, forestry forwarders, possibly somebody good on a track machine as well, or there's ways, and with a grab on the track machine would be perfect. So how you manage that material is going to be very important for the end use if it's going into the energy sector. So that's something to consider as well. So it's now that you're going to take this material and do something different with it, you have to look at how you're collecting it, how you're gathering it, and how you're sorting it to ensure that you're getting the correct use of it. So I'll just go on to the next slide there, Sean. So this table here really lays out all the different options you have on it. So, and where the material is coming from. So obviously, as I described already, hedgerow maintenance, if it's been maintained every 1, 2, or even 3 years, you're looking at a flail hedge cutter. That'll produce small material. It's very easily dealt with. In fact, it doesn't need any active management at all. It's flailed back into the hedgerow. It adds to biodiversity within the hedgerow, so it's got a double benefit there as well. And it's something that doesn't need to be actively managed afterwards once the cutting is done. In terms of hedgerow restoration, so where you have material that's gone on a number of years, you're going to have larger diameter timber in that. So that is going to need different management. It's not going to be something you can flail back into the hedge. So that has to be collected. And you've got to look at what options are there. Again, Stephen will go more into that, but is the material obviously big enough for firewood use, which is ideal for the farm itself? Is there smaller material, that's branching material? Do you shred that? Do you do whatever with it? And we'll let Stephen go into those details as well. But that's really the longer term maintenance and bringing hedgerows back into an active use. We see that a lot, especially where the management of the farm may change, where land has been purchased and maybe the previous owner had neglected hedgerows. You'll see a lot of material there that has to be dealt with in that context. And it's worth pointing out that at that point as well, we all know it's not a case of how you manage this is just leave the hedgerows and don't cut them at all, because ultimately you're going to end up with an awful lot of material at the end of it, and it'll start encroaching on fields. So it has to be dealt with properly. And the option there has to be an active maintenance is the main way of dealing with The last two things really there are windfall material. Obviously, we're seeing storm material coming out a lot, and that's a regular thing. Right through any year, you'll see a certain amount of that material. So principally, that material will be larger. You're looking at a chainsaw. You're looking at, is the material that's useful for firewood on the farm itself, or then the smaller material. Stephen will go into more of that again in terms of your options and how you deal with that. And that's often the little bit more troublesome material to deal with. And then finally, then, as I said earlier, the material resulting from pest and disease impact. Normally, this is not an issue, but we are facing a period now where we're seeing upwards of 70% of our ash trees heavily infected with ash dieback. So, and that percentage is likely to grow, and we're seeing a percentage of those trees already dead. We're seeing an element of that material from the experience we've seen within forestry. They rot very quickly. They can become dangerous very quickly, and they become weak very quickly. So that material is going to be subject to wind blow. It is going to be, if it's not dealt with. And the advice on that is, it's very hard to give clear advice on it, but it's some absolute caution needs to be advised in terms of dealing with ash material that's been infected, because it is unpredictable in the way it'll break, in the way it'll cut, in the way it'll fall. And there is going to be, unfortunately, it's very hard to see how the amount of trees that are going to come down in the next number of years. It has a serious health and safety implications for any farmer, and we can only advise caution in that. Once that material is down, it's got to be dealt with as well. So again, that's material, chainsaw material. It's going to be larger material coupled up with the light branches further up in the tree, and how we use that material. It could be for firewood, ideal for that, or it may have other uses as well. So, but that material, we're going to see a lot more of it over the next couple of years. So I'll pass over to Stephen then, who'll go into more of the techniques and dealing with the final material.
Okay, so thanks, Noel, for that. As Noel said, I'll go through just some of the key findings and summary points that we've discussed here, and expand upon them slightly. I might just switch off my video. Sorry, my internet is not. Yeah. So just from a reduction perspective, so a means to reduce the amount of green waste that needs management in the first place. Obviously, as Noel has identified, the practice of regularly flaying is one route for maintaining hedgerows, without the need for further processing the material, because the coarsely chopped biomass is essentially flung back into the base of the hedge, where it'll eventually decompose. It'll provide a food source for invertebrates, etc. And now, of course, farmers who use regular flaying as a management technique, they must try and balance environmental, practical, and biodiversity considerations on their farm. So that's just something to be mindful. Okay, next slide, please. So next up, we have the firewood use for on-farm use. So that's a fairly obvious use of the larger woody material, as Noel has described. So the collection and use of the firewood for on-farm. So typically this is for the provision of domestic heat, so heating the farmhouse. Although some farms might be equipped with a boiler or a gasification boiler or a log boiler that is capable of using this material to heat hot water. Now, as with any wood fuel, it should be adequately dried to get your moisture content down to 20–25% before you burn it. And so that'll typically involve storing it for a period of 6 months or longer. But of course, dry firewood is an excellent sustainable source of renewable energy on farm, so for heating the domestic farm home. And so definitely it's an option for the larger woody material. Next up, we would have the likes of a nature pile and biodiversity habitat. So this is fairly simple management technique. So agricultural green waste can be used to create a nature pile on the farm in designated locations, so typically along the field margins or boundaries. So the material is allowed to be stacked and essentially decompose in situ over an extended period of time. So the green waste material pile will function as a habitat for biodiversity, and it'll provide a platform for a multitude of both microfauna and macrofauna, and as well as native flora. And this can incorporate smaller branches of material following the firewood removal, for instance. So the material that you're not going to bring home to burn in your chimney. Okay, next slide, please. So next up, we have the option of chipping or shredding woody biomass for animal bedding, or indeed for composting. So the green waste material can be chipped or shredded and used as winter bedding material for livestock. And then it can also be composted. So there are two options sort of for chipped and shredded material. And when you're using the chipped material as an animal bedding, it's a practical reuse method. So when we're thinking of our waste management hierarchy, reuse on farm. Of course, when you're composting this animal bedding, you end up with a nice nutrient-rich material, which then could be disposed back onto land alongside animal manure. Next slide, please. Now, back to the idea of fuel for off-farm use, this time for energy generation. And here we're talking about wood chip again. So this will require the use of specialist machinery. So if there's a large volume of agricultural green waste that requires management, so if you're dealing with a large volume of material from a large operation or a large hedgerow maintenance operation, sometimes it can make sense for this material to be moved off farm as a source of fuel for energy generation or within local biomass boilers. Now, when there's significant volumes of material available, it might be economically viable for this to be collected potentially by a specialist contractor. And if that's the case and you think you have enough volume to warrant that, you should engage with a specific biomass harvesting contractor before you actively begin, so that they can talk you through the options and make sure that any material that is gathered will be free of contaminants. Now, there are a number of considerations to consider prior to engaging this sort of work. So whether a specialist contractor can come in, the accessibility of the site, the proximity to a large energy user, the soil and land type, the type of year, the volume and tonnage of material that's available. These will all impact, along with the weather conditions and the type and size of material, as to whether it's economically viable or whether it makes sense to bring in an outside contractor to gather this material for offsite energy use. And as mentioned before, and it's a point we're keen to stress, that if this is the route you're taking, we have to ensure that the material is free from soil, stones, and wires, because it'll damage the processing equipment like the chippers. Okay, and in some cases, yeah, it might come in, if there's enough volume of material, it might come in at a cost neutral for the farmer, or in some cases it might provide a positive financial return, depending on the conditions outlined above. Okay, and then finally, one of the main options we also identified is the idea of biochar production. And this is a managed fire approach. It's a thermal conversion process of woody biomass material to produce biochar. Biochar is a stable form of carbon when you thermally convert biomass through the process of pyrolysis. Now, the production and use of biochar on farms as a soil or slurry amendment is becoming increasingly unpopular, and it presents an opportunity for farmers who want to produce their own biochar from their own agricultural green waste and then reuse it on their own farms. And there's a growing number of types of biochar production equipment suitable for on-farm use, such as the units pictured here, and there's more detail on some of these in the report. Including the black kiln here pictured in the top right, which has now begun manufacturing. One of Urbia's newest members, Carbon Resources, have begun making these units in Ireland. So possibly a perfect entry level for farm scale production unit. There are, of course, larger industrial units which can provide heat as well as the biochar, and we see these in some farms across Europe. But that sort of technology can be expensive, whereas the simple low-tech processing options pictured here are probably more likely to be seen on farms. And then finally, just to summarize, the report contains a summary or a kind of a flow chart of all the alternatives identified within the main body of the report, and we've broken them down into on-site and off-site options. So just to help you decide which route you might go down. And they're also further broken down into mechanical and thermal processing. And there's a few options here which I haven't actually touched upon just previously, but they're detailed further in the report. So options like Ramiel wood chip, or the use of certain tree species for tree hay. We were also asked and tasked with considering potential bioeconomy and biorefining options. These may become more viable and more mainstream and more accessible in future, but they'll require the development of supply and value chains in order for them to be widely adopted and practiced. But again, these are discussed in more detail in the body of the report. Okay, Sean, I'll hand it back to you there.
That's great. Thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks to Noel as well for your presentation. So a key recommendation within the report that was for consideration to be given to provide financial support for farmers for woody and biomass chipping equipment. And recently with the announcement of the Targeted Agricultural Modernisation Scheme, TAMS3. There is grant aid available to farmers for woody biomass drying sheds, for PTO-driven wood chipping equipment, and the information there is information available on that. And we didn't obviously it was just a recommendation in the report, but since the report has been published, the Department of Agriculture has launched the TAMS3 program, and page 79 of the explanatory document regarding TAMS contains details of the biomass equipment. So that's and the reference costs associated with that. So just wanted to make people aware, make attendees aware that there is supports available for woody and biomass chipping equipment. We are also aware that there are other sources of funding also available for potentially larger equipment, for contractors and indeed specialists who are in this biomass harvesting and area. And if there's anyone on the call that would like to discuss that further with us, we're happy to engage separately or individually with you on that. So that's the financial support. So this is just a case study now. I won't dwell on this case study here as part of the slides, but we'll have a discussion on this with Stephen just at the end of the presentation. This is the bocage system in France, what they do, and just explain to you more, because we have a lot of local authority attendees today. So just to explain this particular case study from the Baden-Baden region of Germany, which I also mentioned earlier, as really a model site from a local municipality level in terms of this processing of the type of agricultural green waste we talk about. Myself and Stephen have been on this site twice because it's part of one of our RD&D Interreg projects. And there's certainly opportunity, if anyone was interested in organising a trip to Germany to view this site. So again, if that was something that was of interest to you, please get in touch with us, and we can look and see what the opportunities may be in terms of organising something. As I said, the presentation this morning is really just a whistle-stop tour of the main high-level content of the report, and to just give you an idea and trigger maybe interest in terms of reading the full report. If people would like to read the full report, it's available through the QR code that's available here. It's also available through the link that's published there. As Bernard said, the communication is going out to farmers shortly. Will also contain the link. And simply, if you Google feasibility study on agricultural green waste, it does come up in the Google search, and you'll find it either on the Department of Agriculture website or indeed on our own website, the rbia.org website as well. So just to conclude this part, to say that we're happy to take any feedback via the Q&A tab that you have. We're happy to address any questions that you have. I see there are a number of questions that have already come in, so we will address those in a couple of minutes. And if you'd like to get in touch further, my own contact information is available on the screen. And again, if there's anyone on the call this morning that would like a more detailed run through of the report, if you with yourself or indeed with colleagues, feel free to get in touch, and we could see how we could assist in terms of giving you a more comprehensive presentation or summary of the report. But really, it's 100-page, just over 100-page document, and we would encourage you all to read the full report. It's quite an easy read in our opinion, so happy. It would be great if you would do that. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and if I could ask Stephen and Noel and Bernard, if you wish to just turn back on your cameras, and if I could start maybe with you, Noel, maybe just to explain a little further about the whole area of the specialist harvesting. So this you're talking about farmers that might have large quantities of green waste on their farms. So what's your advice? What's the practical advice before anything would be done in terms of that green waste? Is it contact the contractor, and then what would the contractor need and be looking for? Stephen has outlined some of the practical things. There's further detail in the report. What would the contractor require or need, or how would that process work? Can you just explain maybe that at the large scale?
Yeah, so it really, the context there you're talking about, where is there's going to be a large quantity of material, you know, you're talking a couple of lorry loads, that sort of scenario. And generally in that scenario, it's too much to be put into a pile for decomposition, and you need to look at an alternative way. Now, obviously, you can't burn that on site, and it will cause a huge, well, you can't straight out on that. So there is some specialist contractors out there who specialize in producing what's called specified biomass harvest, or used to be called BRASH material. So it's a mix of small diameter and large diameter material that's been chipped down and used to provide fully renewable fuel for larger boiler systems. So, and there's a number of those operating around the country. So really, that material, it's ideal for it. But the advice would be to have a contractor that has dealt with this material and has the equipment to deal with this material. They're going to need to cut it down, to top off your hedge, do whatever needs to be done. That'll need specialist equipment that's laid out on the ground without needing to push it. You're only going to be looking at a forestry forwarder to pick that off the ground, so it's not being dragged, it's not picking up contamination, and stacked to dry. At that point, then you are going to need a chipper to chip that up. So typically the contractors are getting...
What's the process now? So the contractor comes in, assesses the site to give an indication to the farmer if there's a cost or if it's going to be a return to the farmer. What happens then? The contractor...
Yeah, so because the material does have an economic value there. So there is, it will go a long way, if not fully, towards offsetting the cost of the contractor coming in the first place. So the contractor, once that assessment is done, they can come in, they can harvest, they can leave it in piles to dry for a period of time, just bring down the moisture content, and then it can be chipped directly into trailers to go off site.
Done by the contractor with their own equipment. Yeah.
And those contractors exist and are in operation, predominantly work in the forestry sector.
And just a note from the report that when we did engage with contractors around this, there is some of this activity taking place, and we have some kind of minimum quantities and stuff in the report which might be required in order to make this economically viable or whatever, but just this is one option. If I could take you forward then, Noel, and take you back maybe to the smaller scale, can you just explain to me or explain to the attendees about the importance of the firewood aspect and drying the firewood and some of the techniques that would be useful in terms of drying that larger material so that it could be utilized on farm for fuel, for instance?
Yeah, look, practically every farm has a chainsaw. It's something that they're well used to having to deal with, wind blow material and fallen trees. So most farms you'll find have a solid fuel appliance where they can burn this material. The advice there is basically obviously there's new regulations have come out in terms of the moisture content of timber that is going to be burnt. So it does need to be stacked correctly, stacked off the ground in a dry location, ideally with plenty of wind that can get through it to dry it out, and to bring it down to below 25% moisture content. It makes an excellent fuel. It's you're not going to get a more environmentally friendly fuel in terms of it being low carbon, and it's using a resource that it hasn't needed to be transported a long distance, and it's ideal for decarbonizing heating of the domestic home while it's available. So it is something that it's an ideal use for that larger diameter material.
Okay, then if I could just then maybe come to Stephen. There's a number of case studies outlined within the report. We referenced two, the French bocage system and Baden-Baden in Germany. So Stephen, do you want to briefly just take us through what the bocage system in France is, first of all?
Yeah, certainly. So the hedgerow network within sort of that region of France, Brittany region, is quite similar to the field margin boundaries that we would have here in Ireland, and in parts of southern UK as well. And effectively, they were managed hedgerow networks that are actively managed now for the provision of shelter and stock proofing, which is obviously what they were put in there in the first place to do, but they're also actively managed from the perspective of providing biomass, which can be chipped and then fed into local district heating systems. So the practice of bocage is to essentially get multiple uses out of the hedgerow management material. And we have translated a French document made by one of our project partners, where they outline the various different valorization routes for this material. And they did this in association with a kind of a cooperative of agricultural contractors within the Brittany region of France, where they collectively pool resources to chipping machinery. And essentially, the idea is that if you're using the material and chipping it for energetic conversion within district heating systems, that you would minimize transport distances. And so there's a whole collective approach to being able to manage and gather this material. I'd encourage you to have a look at the actual case study within the report, and it sets out some of the considerations. There's also the provision of compost, Ramiel wood chip, various other different bits and pieces of potential outputs for this material, but done in a way that is actively enhancing both the carbon storage aspect of hedgerow network, so continually improving, but also the biodiversity aspects of the hedgerow network, so making sure you're managing for biodiversity, cutting and managing it at the appropriate time of year, so that you're doing the best for nature, but also for material resource efficiency and recovery.
Okay, and Baden-Baden, can you just tell attendees a small bit about Baden-Baden and what they do there and how they deal with
Yes,
it's a similar type of material they deal with in Baden-Baden.
Absolutely. So this site, again, we visited a number of times. It's managed by the municipality, and essentially it's a green waste processing facility for the neighbouring town, which is the town of Baden-Baden, where they take in both sort of management material from hedgerow boundaries, from roadside verges, but also from the locality, from their gardens, so local people can drop their material off.
So it's broader than agricultural waste.
It's not just agricultural
but it's
green
still
waste.
all the same type of green waste.
It's the same material. It's woody material. It's leaf litter. It's landscape management material. It's all that sort of stuff. And what they do, they have a series of mechanical processing stations where they will shred and chip the larger material, which then gets dried and sold as a source of wood fuel to local district heating systems. They have compost production on site. They have a means to valorize fibrous biomass, so not just your woody biomass, but also your leaf litter and your grassy fibrous material, where they can utilize it within their own on-site biogas site. So it's a whole complementary approach to the management of mixed woody and fibrous green biomass for the provision of heat, but also combustion products for off-site use, compost creation, and then they've also added a biochar production unit on at the back end for some of that woody biomass. So they're producing a number of products where management material is kind of centralized. There's district heating networks taken off the site, and it's a very impressive site. Local residents can drop off their material, or local farmers. They can also then fill up and take home compost as well. So it's a whole sort of resource efficient circular economy approach within the municipal level.
Okay, and certainly an example of what could be possible in Ireland potentially. And there's a reference again, Baden-Baden, in the report, and a full case study on that. So if I could go to the questions, there's a number of questions have come in, and I would encourage you, as we're coming not too far off the end of our webinar this morning, if you have any questions, to please submit them in the next minute or two, so we can try and address them as we go through. And maybe, Bernard, if I want to bring you in on the first question, I think when we were developing this report, it was very clear from stakeholders that we need to balance the biodiversity, the practicality of all of this, and also the carbon piece in terms of carbon storage on farms and that. So the first question maybe just is mentioned about small piles from Martin. Is it not the most economically acceptable way to deal with small diameter, to leave that material to decay naturally? That dead was a very valuable source of biodiversity. So I don't know, do you want to maybe comment on that, but also just maybe comment on the balance and need for practical aspects, biodiversity and carbon in the context of this discussion?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Sean. I suppose, look, what we're looking at are the overall sustainability credentials around this. I suppose we're trying to balance both what we want to achieve in relation to hedgerow maintenance, but also, you know, seek optimum co-benefits for biodiversity. So in relation to the question that's asked, yes, most certainly, where there are options to enhance biodiversity, they should be taken. And in terms of the example, look, it can provide a very good biodiversity option on farm. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks very much, Bernard, for that. And Noel or Stephen, do you want to comment further on that as an option? Because I know in our survey, quite a substantial proportion of respondents to the survey picked that as an actual option. 59% of our respondents to our survey picked that as an option they would pick as an alternative to burning. So do you want to comment further maybe on that as an option in terms of the importance of biodiversity and the nature pile aspect, either of you?
Yeah, well, certainly, definitely after the option of firewood recovery, I suppose, to taking out the larger material, you're left with potentially a lot of material that, you know, the easiest thing is to put it into a corner and then forget about it, and then it can do its own thing. It provides a food source for decomposing invertebrates, which then go on to feed further up the food chain. So it's an essential part of the food web. Eventually, half of it will degrade down and create basically into new soil formation over the long term. But from a kind of a light touch approach, it's probably one of the easiest management options is to put it into a corner and let it just decompose and rot down, and, as I say, provide a food and habitat source for a wide variety of biodiversity.
Okay,
which we know.
Thanks, Stephen. If we move on, then just the next question. A question again from Martin, and maybe Stephen, if you want to take this. Any proposals to use rhodo, I assume that's rhododendron, being cleared under an EIP in the West for biochar? So maybe just talk about, we're not familiar with the specific EIP project or maybe the specific area, but just maybe talk broadly about the context. Now, rhododendron isn't covered necessarily in this report because unless it's on farmland as such, but do you want to just comment on that maybe?
Absolutely. So one of the previous projects we were involved in did a lot of biochar characterization studies, and rhododendron was one of the materials we looked at to see what quality of biochar could be produced from it. It is absolutely a very good source of biochar production, and so I am aware of some people who've explored this within Ireland, but I'm not sure if it's directly linked with the EIP project. But absolutely, it can make a valuable source of biochar, and to me, it represents a good opportunity there as well. It makes perfect sense, and of course, with every unit of biochar that you create, you're fixing roughly 3 times the amount of CO2 sequestered. So there's a lot of co-benefits we didn't touch upon. And
if I could just follow on then from that, Stephen, there's a question there about from Marie about emissions arising from the burning of green waste in the biochar units. Now, first of all, it's pyrolysis, so it's not burning. So I think maybe just explain what pyrolysis is and the difference in pyrolysis and combustion, and maybe just
so I suppose
address that.
I suppose the pictures we showed there were either simple sort of retort type processing technologies or what are known as flame cap kilns. Now, there are a whole series of conditions you want to meet before you start producing biochar. You want to make sure your material is seasoned so that eliminates particulates and emissions in the first place. But the way the flame cap operates in principle is that you're not going to get very much emissions. So we were at pains to point that out in our conclusions and report findings that farmers who are already actively making biochar on farm, and there's a number of them in Ireland, that it's not the reduction of the amount of volume of material being handled is not the ultimate aim. It's to terminally convert this biomass into a stable form of carbon that can then be used, whether it's as a soil amendment or slurry amendment. So we were at pains to point that out. But like I said, there are a number of conditions you want to make sure that you meet instead of just going burning wet biomass and saying you're making biochar. You want to do it in some sort of kiln device where the emissions can be controlled, essentially.
Okay, moving on.
Probably just pointing out there as well, Stephen, in terms of the positive environmental impacts of that, both in terms of fixed carbon and in enhancing soil health and soil nutrient capacity, because it's something I've seen myself in a number of organic farms using biochar, and it has a lot of enhancement features that there's obviously the using it in a pile for decomposition has benefits, but also biochar has some significant benefits that shouldn't be ignored.
Absolutely, and there's any number of applications on farm that
Yeah.
biochar can be put into in particular.
Okay, there's
Yep.
one or two questions, Noel, on ash dieback. Again, we're not going to go into we're not experts in ash dieback, but just one or two, just one from Michael. Is there any issue with piling ash dieback material or other disease material for biodiversity? I don't know if can you?
Well, look, again, we're not experts in ash dieback, but ash dieback is now endemic in the country. So whether there's an issue in piling it at this point, it may not be the case. But I suppose we need to talk to the forestry and section on that. Ultimately, it is everywhere. It's not going to cause it to spread any faster by putting it into a biodiversity pile, in my view. But maybe there's experts would have a different view on it. Okay,
and then there's a further follow-on question from Anthony about the safety aspects associated with ash dieback, but again, it's more of a comment, I think, about that there's concerns just around the safety aspects associated with the activity of felling these trees. So just thanks for that comment, Anthony, and we will move on to the next question. So maybe it's a question generally here. So what action has been taken to engage or motivate farmers to reduce green waste? Reuse green waste. So I suppose if I could take that one. So the current the notification form, which has to be completed to local authorities for farmers that are currently burning, contained a series of a checklist that farmers had to declare that they had either reduced the volume of it by certain agricultural practices, reuse it where practical, recycle it using it through a shredder or use as a compost or chipping or through chipping, salvage for a fuel, or dispose of it if none of the above options were available. So at this point, or right through in all the exemptions that were granted, the farmer had to confirm that they had explored all of those. So what we found generally when we did the survey of farmers was that farmers didn't actually assess the uses. They might sign the declaration, but ultimately they hadn't completed a meaningful assessment of the 5 areas and the hierarchy. So burning was the first thought that crossed the mind in most cases, and that's based on the feedback from the survey. So I think in the context of the opportunities which are presented here, there are I think farmers should be motivated to encourage to look at the opportunities as a result of, say, for instance, the economic return potentially from off-site energy use as an option. You know, the other thing that has changed is the latest CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, does no longer penalizes for scrub. So there's a number of changes policy-wise, but also practically wise, in that biodiversity has received more of an enhanced, and that's a very welcome development, more of an enhanced focus in recent years. So I don't know, does anyone of our panelists want to comment on that particular question about how to engage or motivate farmers to reuse the green material? And I think a very key learning from the report was that farmers didn't really understand or hadn't thought about the alternative options, and maybe that ties in then with the whole awareness piece associated with this, and the department is doing work in terms of getting out that information flyer on that. So does anyone want to comment maybe on that in terms of the broader piece? Stephen or Noel or indeed Bernard?
Yeah, I just might make one comment. Look, I suppose certainly we're on a different pathway now, given the exemption is going to cease on the 30th of November. In terms of communication, it will be the first stepping stone to guide farmers in relation to the new approaches that can be adopted. So look, at most certainly, as you've outlined, there were options available up to now, but those alternative approaches that are now going to be there in the absence of burning, I think will be the way forward. So most certainly when we issue that communication, it will guide farmers in that direction, you know.
Okay, and just Noel or Stephen, do you want to further comment anything on that about because you were also involved in the survey? So do you want to comment on that? How to motivate farmers around these particular management changes?
I think just getting knowledge out there, I mean, is the first one. I mean,
okay.
Anecdotally, people will use material that can as a fuel, and if they can't burn it, I think it almost does. A lot of the piles for nature almost going to happen organically, if you excuse the term.
So just we're at the very end of our session, but just one or two final questions and maybe comments. There's one there from Sharon. Thanks to the interest. Can you please clarify, if possible, what communication you mentioned will be taking place with farmers and what that will consist of and when it will be happening? So maybe Bernard, that might be one for you. I know that just to comment on that. You might have the specifics, but just to...
Yeah. So essentially, following the outcome of the report that Sean has gone through, there's key outcomes to that are to develop key communications that have to issue to farmers and landowners. So essentially, they've been worked on over the last number of months with ourselves, AIRBIA, and also the Department of Environment. So they're currently been finalised, and it's planned that they'll all be posted to all landowners and farmers in the country over the next little while, to inform them of the obviously key date changes, but also the new approaches that can be adopted in terms of the management of green waste.
Okay, a couple of comments there then, if I could just take them very briefly. Is there an option for councils to consider the Baden-Baden model to remove roadside ash at a cost-neutral basis at a zero cost to farmers? So certainly that's from Philip. I think certainly the Baden-Baden model is something we would encourage local authorities to maybe contact us about, and we're happy to provide you further information. We might also be able to organise a trip. It's not that far from, it's a bit of a trek from Frankfurt Airport, but a day trip or even an overnight trip potentially could be organised as a knowledge transfer kind of an event around that. So it certainly presents an opportunity. Niamh then was consideration given to the fact that the volume of green waste may be higher than the notification to burn would imply. So we did identify through the survey, and this is included within the report, that there were a number of people that didn't complete the notification form, a number of farmers that weren't in compliance as a result. That's, the survey is quite interesting from that perspective. So again, I think this all comes back to a communications piece about but look, I'd encourage Niamh to have a look at the survey, and there is an answer to your question within the survey, but unfortunately we've run out of time and we'll be able to go into it. So I think we have dealt with most of the questions which have come forward. So at that, I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you very much to Stephen, to Noel, and to Bernard for attending and presenting and participating this morning. I'd like to also thank our Teresa O'Brien, who behind the scenes makes all this happen from the point of view of organising all aspects associated with this webinar. So thanks to Teresa for your ongoing work in terms of organising the webinar. And finally, just I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning. We had a very sizable attendance this morning. As I said, the recording of this will be available, so if colleagues of yours have not seen or couldn't join, feel free to circulate the recording to them or notification, and we would encourage you to read the report. And if you have any questions on the report, feel free to get in touch with us, and we're happy to discuss any aspect of the report further with anyone that has any further questions. So with that, we will conclude the webinar by saying thank you all, and we look forward to meeting you again soon on our next webinar. Thank you. Good morning. Bye-bye.